So we are going live now. Konbanwa to our friends in Japan. Good morning to our partners in the United States. And good afternoon to the audience in India. I'm Hemant Singh, Director General, Delhi Policy Group. And it is my great pleasure to welcome panelists to this DPG webinar on the Ukraine conflict and its strategic implications. We all know that this conflict is now in the second year. And despite the catastrophic humanitarian consequences and the devastating economic impact, the protagonists are still prioritizing military victory. Risks of escalation to a wider conflict are rising as Europe radiates instability. We have a stellar panel for you to assess developments related to Ukraine and present a range of perspectives. Ambassador Kenichiro Sasai will kick off the discussions. He is the president of the Japan Institute of International Affairs and a very distinguished diplomat who has held key positions as vice minister at Gaimusho and Japan's envoy to the US. Professor Kazuto Suzuki is professor at the Graduate School of Public Policy, University of Tokyo, and also the director of the Institute of Geoeconomics, International House of Japan in Tokyo. Eric Brown is senior fellow at the Hudson Institute in Washington, DC, where he studies Asian and Middle East affairs, international security, US diplomacy, and strategy. Ambassador Nalin Suri will take the lead among the Indian panelists. He is distinguished fellow for diplomacy at DPG and has vast experience of Europe, both East and West. Lieutenant General D.S. Huda is senior fellow for military strategy at DPG and a well-known authority on security issues. And Brigadier Arun Sehgal is senior fellow for strategic and regional security at DPG and a renowned expert on global strategic stability. So let me begin this session with some broad opening remarks as the moderator. As this conflict goes on into the second year, I think it would be fair to say that the world stands divided and also at a dangerous impasse. If anything, the fault lines seem to be hardening. Russia has dealt a harsh blow to world order with its military aggression and is paying a heavy price for it. But its invasion, in fact, was widely anticipated. The issue of Russia's place in the European order has persisted since the end of the Cold War and still awaits a resolution. In the ongoing battle of narratives, unfortunately, rational discourse is increasingly missing. Talk of continued war and even escalation is being normalized, while appeals for restraint and peace are sidelined. It is being suggested that a just and lasting peace must be achieved on the battlefield and with no compromises. Blending such absolute war aims, even when these are linked to political principles, with the necessary strategic pragmatism will not be easy. The fact is that peace cannot be imposed by subjugation. It will require a substantial measure of accommodation. So let me briefly outline some salient issues related to the crisis 1 year down. First, what has the conflict done? And I have 3 or 4 points to make there. It has fragmented the international community, with the majority of the world's nations not taking sides between the great power protagonists. This trend will only likely grow as the conflict continues and the rivalry between the US-led West and the Russia-China axis intensifies. The conflict has certainly reinvigorated the West, which has coalesced around the G7 and NATO, while Russia and China have countered with an unprecedented comprehensive strategic partnership of coordination for a new era. It has raised the specter of a wider conflict, once again emanating from Europe's failure to manage deep-rooted civilizational antagonisms. It has, at least thus far, marginalized the role of diplomacy and resort to the peaceful settlement of disputes. It is bringing cooperation on global issues to a virtual standstill. and it is marginalizing the interests of the global South, which is of great concern to India as it chairs the G20 this year. If I can say a word about what the conflict is really about, at least in its origins, there can be several viewpoints on this, but it is mostly about dominance over European security architecture, and perhaps even a return to the post-history unipolar moment of 1991. However, a continuing conflict will not heal Europe's civilizational rivalries, which will most likely continue to fester without resolution for decades, creating prolonged instability. It is being suggested that Europe today can be Asia tomorrow. This line of thinking, to my mind, overlooks the fact that the historical and civilizational realities in Asia are distinct, divergent from Europe, and have different drivers. There is no NATO in Asia and no Asian NATO. Asia today comprises several rising and strategically independent powers and is increasingly multipolar. Let me amplify that point a bit. The US holds complete sway over its European allies, but a European leader recently came to Asia to assert strategic autonomy vis-a-vis the US on relations with China, which just happens to be the main source of authoritarian expansionism in Asia. His remarks cautioning Europe not to get trapped in a crisis that is not ours only drew attention to Europe's actual lack of political will or capability to play a meaningful role in Asia's strategic equations. Finally, and to sum up my points, what does the conflict indicate? First, that the main source of US power and influence resides in the Euro-Atlantic. US preeminence is under major challenge in the Indo-Pacific. Second, that the US is mostly absent on the Eurasian heartland and can leverage only limited power from its allies in the Indo-Pacific maritime, which means that it must lead primarily from its own strength in the Indo-Pacific. Third, that an overextended US and a battered Russia are opening up greater strategic space for China, which is consolidating its power and expanding the reach of its influence across broader Asia. Fourth, that the future of world order will not be determined in Europe, but in Asia and the Indo-Pacific, depending on how the increasingly all-pervasive competition between the US and China plays out. And fifth, it is becoming increasingly more imperative than ever that the US, India, and Japan and their other regional partners should reinforce efforts to ensure a stable, secure, and prosperous Indo-Pacific. So those are my remarks, opening remarks as the moderator. And we now start our discussion with the panelists. Ambassador Kenichiro Sasai, you have the floor.
Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning, everyone. Thank you very much, Ambassador Hemant Singh, for having me on this DPG-sponsored webinar. I very much looking forward to having a stimulative discussion. Let me just follow through the 6 points you suggested in advance. On some of the topics that we could address. One, you were asking on the Ukraine war outlooks of the thought. I think most of the things you have said in your initial statement is reflective of the difficulties around us. It is likely to be a prolonged conflict unless there is A, decisive victory on the ground by either side, B, Russian domestic disruption, including Putin's fall down, C, Western fatigue and disunity in the support of Ukraine. I don't see any signs of these seriously taking place. So at best, it could be a de facto frozen conflict, and at worst, larger conflict and escalation, nuclear or more direct NATO involvement. we could think around many possibilities, but at this moment, it is not necessarily clear where we are heading for at this moment. Two, geostrategic drivers prolonging the conflict. Yes, to the West, Russian invasion is not only a matter of international rule of law, but the brutal, I would say, expansions of Russian reconquista as well. To Russian, it is the West that turned the conflict with Ukraine to the war against Russia. Of course, this is a Russian propaganda, but they continue to sound this propaganda throughout the world. Some of the global South are echoing in parallel, but I don't think they are persuading the global opinion yet. Three, the cost of delayed peace. Yes, as you say, for example, more strategic divide, both global and regional. Hemant was basically talking about this is a European civilizational conflict and so forth. I don't necessarily agree with that, prognosis, because I think the impact of this Russian invasion of Ukraine goes beyond the European conflict, and I think the impact on the rule of law and all these values we have, nurtured over 70 years after the war, is now faced with a tremendous challenge, and so the cost of this delayed peace is very serious. I mean, this could be more divisive, both global and regional. And B, I think there will be a more global macroeconomic and energy, food, and other economic security divide. I think it's taking place, including all the divide of supply chain and so forth. That could be, of course, accentuated in the years come. See, I think there are more armament, rather than disarmament, including cyber and outer space, whether you like it or not. For the global realignment of major powers and their sphere of influence, I think, yes, there are the West, the defender of the existing global order. They will continue to defend the existing order, not necessarily replaced by somebody else, inherent thinking and unique order. Two, I think major autocratic forces like Russian, China, I think they're more in line with their own ambition and feel more affinity with each other. I think C, global South of a variety of interest and concern. I think the major global nations like India, Brazil, and South Africa play more influential and hopefully stabilizing role. I don't think their role is marginalized by all this Western and Russian rivalry. Of course, the impact of those rivalry is keenly felt on the global scene, but I don't think the power of global South is on the rise. I might be wrong, but I'd like to hear more from the Indian colleagues' view on this point. Five, I think impact on the Asian and Indo-Pacific strategy. I think Indo-Pacific are getting more focused strategic ascensions. I think that is true. And it doesn't mean that we would think that the European strategic issues are less important than those strategic issues in the Pacific. I have some slightly different views from Hemant on this aspect. I think we need to treat the European strategic issues in the same way as we do in the Pacific. Of course, there should be more focus in the coming years because of long-term, the biggest challenges coming from China. That is another set of issues, I think, different from Russians' strategic challenges before us. Thrusting point in the region continue to be on Chinese expansions and ambitions and Korean Peninsula, and I would say Indian Ocean too. these three major focus continue to be a flashing point in the future. But their dealing will be propelled more by their own strategic interests. And it's not easy to reconcile what are the ambitions and the difference of the strategic motivation. And finally, scenario for the global power balance. I think the accelerated military buildup and the further adventure of Russian China, or their eventual falling down. Either one of these extreme is not desirable, but might be possible. B, I think global South might increase their voices, but not necessarily in unity. I think there are more diversified voices around the global South. We can't simply say that global South is acting like G77 in the Cold War days. And finally, I think the global governance, including the United Nations, might be more power-driven and more edgy battleground for those seeking the supremacy of power and try to make their influence felt more in global, I think, dimension than global governance arena. I will stop here.
For bringing out your views on each of the items which we requested panelists to address. And I take your point about the Global South not being a cohesive, united whole, but nonetheless, it is a very large part of the international community. And if you believe The Economist, then 127 nations are not taking any sides in this conflict, which by any measure is a vast majority of the globe. So the counter really would be to bring up the expectation that the entire world would submit to decision-making by the G7 on economic issues and the NATO Security Pact on security issues. That also is not very likely to be happening. So some middle ground, some meeting ground has to be found. And certainly countries like India and Japan have a major role to play to bring the G7 and the G20 together in trying to work out in a very rational, balanced and pragmatic manner how to manage issues which are emerging before the world community. Okay, so over to Nalin, Ambassador Suri, you have the floor.
Thank you, Hemant, and thank you, Ambassador Sai, for a very precise presentation covering the entire agenda. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. It's lovely to be back together, if online, if not offline. The timing of this webinar is, to my mind, eerily prescient. So much has happened earlier in the month that has a serious bearing on our deliberations today. President Macron and EU President von der Leyen have been to China. So have Japan and Germany's foreign ministers. The Taiwan president has been to the USA. Finland has joined NATO. The Chinese defense minister has paid an important visit to Russia. And there has been a huge leak in the US of classified documents pertaining to the Ukraine war and the way ahead. There are credible reports that both the Russian and Ukrainian sides are seriously preparing for a so-called spring offensive, the outcome of which may determine how the future will pan out, and including any possible resolution to this war in Ukraine. Importantly, perhaps most importantly, the G7 foreign ministers have very recently finished a prolonged meeting in Karuizawa, Nagano, I hope I got the pronunciation right, where they have deliberated at length on Ukraine, the Indo-Pacific, and China, among other issues. Their views are significant since, to my mind, it is the G7 that is the principal driver on the Ukrainian side that will determine the direction the war will take and related aspects, including about an ultimate compromise to end the war. It bears reminding that this is a European war imposed on the rest of the world because of the unfinished business post the end of the Cold War of establishing dominance of the US-led order in Europe. Strategic security in Europe has been seriously undermined by the Ukraine war. The course of the war and related actions taken have effectively upended the existing global order and institutions and is imposing huge costs and disabilities on the developing world, which had nowhere near recovered from the double whammy of the global financial crisis and the COVID-19 pandemic. Regrettably, only lip service has been paid to the problems so far for development, poverty alleviation, and the technological upgradation of the developing world. Ironically, the G7 Foreign Ministers' declaration of 18th April this month seems to suggest that business as usual is feasible in matters of international governance. Whether one likes it or not, China is now embedded on the side of Russia on the Ukraine war issue. This is because it suits China as much as it suits Russia. Both need each other and have openly acknowledged this, even though they may not agree with each other on all aspects of policy or ideology. But they have both agreed that, and I quote, "It is unacceptable to replace recognized principles and norms of international law with rules-based order," unquote. They describe their renewed partnership as a strategic choice. They do not accept, let me quote again, "the hypocritical narrative of the so-called democracy against authoritarianism," unquote too. In fact, both China and Russia believe that the West, led by the United States, is seeking to contain their nations and undermine their development and destinies. The ongoing war in Ukraine has emboldened the DPRK to strengthen its nuclear and missile arsenal, which they see as a legitimate means of defending their sovereignty and territorial integrity. Taiwan has willy-nilly become an integral part of the narrative, and the question being asked is whether China can do a Ukraine to Taiwan. As we meet today, possibly on the eve of what might be the beginning of a spring offensive by either side in the Ukraine war, the least I hope we can agree on is that the situation is fraught with great danger, and unless good sense prevails or is made to prevail, the outcome will certainly be a catastrophe for Europe, but will not spare those in the rest of the world either. The latter are helplessly, even haplessly, being forced to pay a huge price for the games being played in Europe for control over the future narrative for European stability and integration, as also a global governance, development, security, and stability. The question is whether an acceptable compromise can be worked out to end the Ukraine war. So far, both sides have laid out their harsh red lines. But I am an internal optimist and would like to believe that the latest G7 foreign ministers' communique on Ukraine is less rigid on how the war there can begin to end than earlier suggestions in this regard. Perhaps Japanese colleagues here can shed some light on this. I only hope I am not wrong. Interestingly, the Japanese Foreign Office has said that 100 minutes was spent by the ministers discussing Ukraine. For peace to return to Ukraine and Europe, the lead, in my view, will have to be taken by the United States. Some European countries have already asked China to help bring Russia to the table. Is the United States on board with this approach? Maybe Eric can weigh in on this. The Sino-Russian partnership will indeed impact on Asian and Indo-Pacific security and stability. Signs of this are already visible. As the war in Ukraine persists or intensifies, the impact may well grow. The latter may encourage NATO to seek a greater role in the region for itself. It has already given itself an opening for this at the Madrid summit in June 2022, last year. Importing European problems into Asia and the Indo-Pacific would be most unfortunate and seriously impinge on the evolving multipolarity nature and the Indo-Pacific architecture. This does not, however, mean that countries in Asia and the Indo-Pacific cannot bilaterally or plurilaterally enter into appropriate strategic, economic, and technological partnerships with one another. The grave danger, uncertainties, and disruptions that have arisen due to the war in Ukraine are compounded by the relatively gloomy economic prospects for the world economy in the near future. There is thus an urgent need to bring the search for the light at the end of the tunnel and for establishing a fresh architecture for European strategic stability that unites rather than sustains historical divisions. The principles underlying the Indo-Pacific, which all of us are agreed on, could serve as the underpinnings for this purpose. Let me stop at this point.
Thank you, Nalin. Thank you for sharing your views and also for striking a hopeful note that we may see some way forward towards more pragmatic solutions to this conflict before it escalates and becomes an even more serious problem for the international community. May I now invite Professor Suzuki Kazuto to give his remarks as panelist.
Sure. Thank you very much, Ambassador Sin. Thank you very much for inviting me for this very honorable workshop. I thank the Delhi Policy Group for this organizing this this event. Let me just. I think there is a sort of a striking differences from what Ambassador Sasai has mentioned and what Ambassador Sin and Ambassador Surya has mentioned. I think the perception from Japan is somewhat different from perception from India. I do concur with the Ambassador Sasai's analysis of the current ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine. I think this is war is all about the will of the people. It's not about you know, the size of the size of the army or the sophistication of the technology. I think at the end of the day, it is up to the President Putin and the President Zelensky to you know, whether they pursue their own objectives or not. And I think at this moment it is very difficult to assume that the President Putin will give up his ambition to control over the policies of the Ukraine, which is clearly a violation of international order and international law. So as long as so I think it's hypocritic to see when the President Xi Jinping has visited Moscow and the first line of joint communique mentioned you know, the respect of the Charter of the United Nations. So that's one point that I like to make. The second point I like to make is that I think there is a sort of an overestimation of the relationship between transatlantic relationship between Europe and the United States. The United States, as we've seen, you know, during the Trump era, that there is a clear direction, particularly in the Republican camp, that United States is taking a sort of you know, the America First approach, which means that there is no intent to commit to the to shape the international order or the, you know, to intervene in the Ukrainian war. Of course, they do send troops. They don't send troops, but they send the you know, the arms and ammunitions. But still, from my point of view, I think the United States is reluctant to do so because there is a very strong opposition from the Republican camp that to, you know, to intervene too much in the Ukrainian conflict. And the amount of the support, financial and military support to Ukraine is exceeding to the government domestic programs. So I think there is sort of a tendency of inward looking in United States. So I think it is. I do not share the idea that this is the, you know, the United States ambition to shape the world order or the Eurasian order to that extent. I also find the relationship between China and Russia is somewhat cozy, but not really substantial, because at the end of the day, China is benefiting from the cheap oil, accessing cheap oil and exporting its own, the various commodities. But China is still very reluctant to help support the military actions in Ukraine. They don't do it verbally, nor financially, nor militarily. So China has been very cautious about the response and reaction from the United States, because from Chinese point of view, losing the access to the U.S. market is the much more negative than its support, or the gain that it can get from supporting Russia. So they do support Russia, but it's basically a moral support and not the substantial support for continuing the warfare. I think the analysis or the evaluation of the power of the global south is, I do agree that this is a very important element of the current global order. I think this is a consequence of the globalization. There are a significant amount of investment and economic growth in the global south, particularly countries like India, Brazil, Argentina. There are countries which are still struggling to get those fruits, but so far I think there is a changing balances of the balances of the power between the former colonial, the former colonizing countries like in Europe and the global south. So in terms of the support for the war in Ukraine, the global south is not, they do take the sort of they sit on the fence. They are not taking the pros and cons of the war. They just think that they are not committed. But at least when we see the voting patterns of the UN General Assembly, it is true that the morally speaking, from the international legal perspective, these global souths are unanimously condemn Russia for violating the territorial integrity. So so I think this is one of the points that, even though they are condemning Russia for violation of the international law, but they are not doing the global south. The countries of global south is not doing further. So basically, they are taking no more actions against this, and therefore, I think I can conclude that the impact of the global order of the war in Ukraine is not global. It is regional. It is the European, and it may change the shape of the European order, and it has already done, to change the position of the Finland and Sweden to seek the accession to the NATO. But apart from that, I think there is not much dynamic change. The NATO remains as a NATO, and as a collective defense alliance, and I don't think the NATO is going to dominate the world. NATO is still functioning as the deterrence. I think the key word is a deterrence, and this is one of the points that this is one of the reasons why the Russia has not shot a single bullet to the NATO countries. And this is the deterrence in action. Usually you don't see the deterrence unless it's broken, but I think this is the reality. And I think it is remain the NATO remains as the a collective action alliance to prevent the Russia not to shoot, or to prevent Russia to shoot any countries of the NATO states, and therefore the Finland realized that it is much, in order to improve their security, the membership of NATO is much better than the so-called Finlandization. So I'll stop here and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor. That was very interesting and very candid, the remarks which you have shared with us. It does occur, the thought does occur to me, however, that if there was deterrence in Europe, then this invasion of Russia might never have happened. And
no, because Ukraine is not a member of NATO.
yes, but the signs of the dissension over European security order, precisely between NATO and Russia, are all writ large.
No. There are countries, Russia, NATO, and non-NATO countries. So that's why, Finland and Sweden decided to join the NATO, because they feel more insecure if they don't join the NATO.
Okay, my sense was somewhat different. It is not exactly in that line, but what I was saying was that there was neither a prevention nor a deterrence factor which was at work before the Russians actually invaded. Anyway, we can continue that discussion later. May I now turn to Eric Brown, our friend from the United States. Eric, please tell us how Washington is viewing these developments and bring us up to speed, because there's lots been happening. Over to you, Eric.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Ambassador Singh, and to my friends at DPG. It's great to see everyone and to hear all that has been said. I don't speak for Washington, D.C., but I'll do my best to divine the tea leaves and to try to express how I think the discussion has been trending here in the United States and elsewhere. Let me begin by saying that I'm very happy that DPG is having this discussion about Ukraine and its consequences for future world order, not least because I do think that the costs of delayed peace are quite profound and will be long lasting, and that this war will have consequences that will be unfolding for years to come. I was in West Asia, in Iraq, some months back, and spoke to a retired Iraqi Corps commander who had been a young infantryman in the 1980 to 1988 war between Iran and Iraq. And that war, as we all know, was catastrophic for both of those countries. And I thought that he made a very apt observation. He compared the conflict in Ukraine to the Iran-Iraq war. And the point that he was trying to drive was that the political leaders on both sides were not under sufficient pressure at all to end the war. And that this what contributed to the fact that the war lasted for 8 years and consumed enormous numbers of young lives and allowed passions and zealotry and all kinds of irrational thinking to come to the fore, leading to, again, a catastrophe that, as we were all well aware, continued to hold both Iran and Iraq in a vice grip for 40 years to follow. I think that that is the right way to begin to think about Russia's aggression in Ukraine and the long-term consequences of that for Russia, for Ukraine, and elsewhere. I disagree a bit, however, with the analysis in the sense that I would say that the perception in the United States, and I think that this is true, is that Russia has been very much not only the aggressor here, but in the driver's seat. and continuing to up the ante, and that the United States has not chosen this conflict. And on a number of occasions from the start of the hostilities, the United States has tried to begin conversations with Russia about an off-ramp. What very few analyses tend to factor into this discussion has been the tremendous power of an example of Zelensky, and the fact that Russia's aggression has not only spectacularly failed, but it's managed to produce a political development in Ukraine that Russia was attempting to stifle to begin with, and that is the birth of a Ukrainian nation. To see Zelensky's leadership here surprised a lot of people here in the United States. It's true, as a democracy, we have a natural sympathy for democracies and for nations. And this was something that just didn't factor into the US analysis in the first few months of the conflict. Those sympathies are not necessarily sufficient to support a policy that makes war termination unachievable. But I would encourage, I would want to ask Ambassador Suri, what in his view and what in India's view, insofar as the United States has any control over termination of this conflict, what the United States and Western countries would have to give up, and what the consequences of that would be for countries like India and for our closest allies in East Asia, like Japan. Because the United States is not simply supporting Ukraine on the basis of sympathy, nor are we supporting it with the view that NATO needs to expand indefinitely. I think there's a very pragmatic understanding here in the United States that NATO will not expand in the future. That it needs to focus on territorial defense, and that anybody who believed prior to the Ukraine war that expansion was desirable should at least try to explain where the resources were going to come to make that expansion not provocative, but to make it successful in terms of deterrence. But I want to ask, I mean, should the United States accept what needs to be done to accommodate Russia's aggression in Ukraine? And what are the consequences of that for the future of the Indo-Pacific? Because I do think that while the United States has provided Russia with a number of off-ramps, and while the United States has very little credibility, I would say as well, in Moscow, there has been a recognition that the outcome of the war in Southeast Europe fundamentally affects the nature of the strategic rivalries that are developing in the Indo-Pacific. About 3 weeks after the United States, I think, very publicly offered an off-ramp to Putin, he threatened or began to brandish his tactical nuclear weapon capability. What are the consequences of allowing a highly militarized behemoth to invade a country that did not threaten it in an act of trying to destroy? The useful word to describe, I think, what has animated Russian conduct has been nation-side, a desire to just destroy the birth of a national civilization that somehow affects Russia's integral security. I don't buy the Russian narrative, as it were, that what provoked the Ukraine conflict was Americanism or the expansion of NATO. It was, I think, fundamentally the birth of a nation in Ukraine, which was fundamentally destabilizing to Russia's geopolitical ambitions. I say all this because, yes, the costs of peace are quite profound. I really commend India's leadership and its efforts to try to find a way to de-escalate and to terminate this conflict. I think more of that inspired leadership is going to be required because I don't see it coming from Europe. And I think that America, frankly, has very little credibility in Moscow to be able to have that conversation in Moscow. So I want to see more Indian leadership on this. And I think that the consequences of failing to find a peace are really quite profound. You know, prior to the conflict, I would say that most Americans who thought about it wanted to see Russia, not necessarily harmonized, as it were, with the liberal democratic West, but at least a Russia that could hold its own and had good, useful, productive ties that were beneficial both to India and to Japan. That vision disappeared when Russia invaded the Ukraine. It completely evaporated. Now, because of Russia's belligerence, because of its aggression, because of its failure to imagine a way out of this conflict, I worry that it has committed itself to a pathway of deindustrialization. And that's going to invite greater resistance from the West. As you've seen, there's been a spectacular failure in Russia's analysis of the West that somehow it was going to fold in the event, in the face of its aggression. But if Russia deindustrializes, its economy continues to fold in. You have not only 200,000 young men that have been destroyed in Ukraine as invaders, but the consequences of the war itself is going to be working its way through Russian society for years to come. I think that poses a profound strategic challenge for all of us who are interested in maintaining the peace in the Indo-Pacific, a profound challenge. And I think that it would be useful for the future-oriented thinkers in Japan, in India, and in the United States to think about that as just being something that we're going to have to deal with. How is India going to make up for the potential loss of a useful defense procurements, for example? Diversification and Indianization is a process that I know is well underway. I think we need to have very practical discussions about how the United States and Japan together can abet that process in India. Because again, I worry that Russia has committed itself to a path of suicide. There's so much more to really say about this. I do want to end, though, because we have time for discussion. I do want to end, though, by saying something about the Global South. The Global South has been short-shrifted in US policy. I would say that one long-term trajectory that we're already seeing is that the rivalry between India and China over leadership of the G77 is going to increase. And I think a practical question that India, Japan, and the United States has to be asking is, what can the leading democracies of East Asia, the US included, do to abet India's hand in that rivalry with China over the G77, within the G77? I think that is a practical question that can help focus some of our discussions going forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eric. Very interesting remarks. One part of those remarks, I think, which echoed the question which had been raised by Professor Suzuki as well, which pertains to Europe and how to bring peace to Europe and stability in Europe. I'll let my colleague, Ambassador Suri, answer that because he's more of an expert on Europe, East and West. Yes, indeed, it is important for the United States and Japan to realize the role which India is playing across the Global South. Unfortunately, there's not too much indication coming out of G7 regarding a outreach to the G20 or India's leadership at G20, apart from a very helpful mention that the G7 will help make sure that India's chairmanship of G20 will be successful. So that's another issue which I think we can follow up on in the subsequent dialogue today. So over to General Huda now. For General, how do you assess the military situation? Because so far we've been talking geopolitics and regional global architecture issues. So bring us up to speed on what's happening on the ground in the war.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. So as Ambassador Hemant has brought out, I'm going to talk about the military aspects of the Ukraine war, focusing on what we are going to see in the coming months of 2023. Currently, as we look at the situation, the war has become almost a grinding stalemate, with bloody battles happening in the east and a very heavily fortified frontier that has come up in the south, where Russia is on the defensive. What we are hearing is that both sides are now ready for a renewed conflict in the spring or summer of 2023. Ukraine is training and arming about 12 brigades, which they say are meant for a spring offensive. These are about 60,000 soldiers with equipment supplied by the US and NATO, as well as training being carried out by NATO. And this is what is going to be employed, as per reports, for either a spring or a summer offensive. On the Russian side, we know last year about 300,000 reservists were mobilized. They are also available. Some have already been utilized in the operations that are going on in the east, and these could be further utilized for a push into the Donetsk and Luhansk regions in the coming months. Now, what are the prospects? So with both sides readying for a military operation, what are the prospects of a major military victory by either side? Because as previous speakers have brought out, one way that the war will end in Ukraine is if there is a major military victory by either side. And I'm afraid my own sort of analysis is that any prospect of a major military victory by either side is slim. And I'm saying that for a few reasons. If you look at Ukraine, the 12 brigades that we are hearing about are not yet completely ready with training and with their full equipment. So some dates that came out in the leaked Pentagon documents were as early as 30th April that the offensive will commence. I think it's not likely to happen. It might take a little more time. Also, from what we can gauge is that the Ukraine offensive is likely to go into the south. And it is in the south that the Russians have made a series of extremely formidable defenses. So you're not going to see the kind of success of September 2022 last year, where Ukraine counteroffensive went in very quickly. So they have developed very strong defensive lines with anti-tank mines, with Dragon Claw anti-tank ditches, anti-tank obstacles. Huge defenses have come up. So it's going to be a very difficult sort of operation that Ukraine will have to undertake in the south. And we are also hearing about lack of equipment and ammunition. The air defense missiles have almost run out. The air defense missiles that Ukraine largely had were of Russian origin. The S-300, for example, have already run out. RT shells are being rationed, and that is why you see a great push in the EU. I think they've sanctioned something like €2 billion for supply of ammunition. But this all is going to take a little time. So my sort of assessment is that yes, Ukraine will probably launch a counteroffensive to retake territory. However, major victories are not possible. And there is a similar problem on the Russian side. We have seen that the winter offensive that they undertook has just got completely bogged down around Bakhmut. And while the Russians could put in some more troops, their past performance doesn't give the kind of confidence that is required for a major military victory. They've also had massive losses in equipment. So you're hearing about much older tanks which were mothballed. Vintage equipment is now being pulled out and is being put into battle. Air power has been used in a very limited way. And so even on the Russian side, unless there is a further mobilization, which is being resisted in Russia itself, we don't want greater mobilization. I think they may just hold on or have some limited gains and losses. So what I think we are going to see is more of the same that you are seeing now. Yes, there will be some offensive, but the war is likely to continue in the way that it is continuing with limited successes on both sides. So what does this mean for the future of European security, even assuming that the Ukraine war gets over with whatever conditions are put by either side? If you're looking long term at the future of European security, it's obviously going to be dominated by a security-insecurity paradox, where you're going to find Russian aggressive behavior bringing in a sense of insecurity on NATO, and NATO rearming itself, further expansion of NATO, bringing in a sense of insecurity in Russia. So how is this going to be balanced? What is going to be the, how you address NATO and Russia security concerns on both sides, I think, is going to dominate what future European security looks like. But I want to end with one point, that Europe also has to look internally in a bid to resolve its internal ethnic conflicts. Last 25 years, we've seen Yugoslav wars in Chechnya, Georgia, Crimea, Ukraine, in the Donetsk region between 2014 and 2021, almost 14,000 people have been killed. And a lot of these wars are driven by issues of ethnicity, and that needs to be sort of tackled. We do talk about territorial integrity, but post 1990, 17 new countries have been created in Europe. And so these are issues I think even internally Europe needs to look at. So I will end here, and if there are any questions, I'll take them then. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, General Huda. That was very helpful from the military side. We needed that perspective coming from you. Some of those elements regarding, again, security, insecurity paradigm and how to resolve. Again, we will leave it to Ambassador Suri to comment later. Now, our last speaker is Brigadier Arun Sehgal. Arun, you have the floor. I think you are going to talk about strategic stability and issues of strategic balance. Over to you.
Thank you, Ambassador. My remarks basically cover the state of play in the Indo-Pacific and what are the consequences of the Ukraine war on the Indo-Pacific. The reason I say this is because I believe that the repercussion of the conflict in Ukraine is triggering a major geopolitical competition with the hardening of lines between the two blocs, the US-led Western Bloc and the China-Russia strategic alignment. The fundamental point is that I see that the preoccupation with European theater is taking the mind of the American-led alliance system in Indo-Pacific from this critical region where the Chinese influence is on the increase. And this is not happening for the first time. It happened in the past, in the recent past, when Iraq and Afghanistan allowed 2 decades of clear period for China to build up capacities, enhance its strategic space, and create a largely Sino-centric Asian architecture. What is now happening is that the China and Russia-led combined is in total control of the continental space, starting from Eurasia to Central Asia, going into the rest of the Asian countries. And now it is also increasing the salience in West Asia. The second point to note is that China-Russian combined, or we might look at it, it depends on how you want to look at whether it's glass is half full or glass empty, half empty. But what we are, at least from my perspective, there is a degree of an attempt by China and Russia to create a credible strategic deterrence for the West, A. B, and what is worrisome from my perspective is the fact is that the Chinese are being now provided with the state-of-the-art technological capacities and capabilities, particularly in aero engines. As everybody is aware, the Chinese are very poor, continue to be poor in their aero engines. The nuclear submarines are noisy. The Russians have the capacities to give them that kind of technology, and also a large number of other underwater. And as far as the trade and other issues are concerned, I'm afraid there is a huge jump in the trade between, there's about a 30% jump in the trade between the two countries. So what we are looking at is that there is now Sino-Russian combined and China per se enhancing their strategic space all over Asia and creating capacities all along what I call the rimland, both from the Indo-Pacific, going right up to West Asia to the east coast of Africa. So if you look at this architecture, this is a dangerous architecture, and this is practically because the eyes have been taken off from this region. There is no doubt that the United States is building up capacities and capabilities in the region. It is urging its allies and partners like Japan, which is now trying to invest $100 billion over 5 years in upgrading its military capacities and capabilities, counter strikes, etc. But similarly, the AUKUS program, similarly, Korea is also trying to create minilaterals and trilaterals of security understanding in both Southeast Asia and East Asia, bases in Philippines, etc., are all part of the architecture. But please remember that these elements are time sensitive. They will take minimum of 7 to 10 years to come up to any speed to be able to provide a credible deterrence. An important part of the whole issue, particularly from the security architecture, from the United States and our allies and strategic partners like quadrilateral, is that the United States is an offshore balancer here. And they have to fight with the credible military opponents in location. China is a regional power. It has its capacities, capabilities, and ability to build up resources in location. United States will require time and space to build up these capacities. So this is an important aspect. The other partners will also need that time and space. So this is an issue that we need to take cognizance of. From an Indian perspective, the concern that we have that creates for us is this, and Eric, you talked about how people can collaborate. But let me put this point across. The issue is that as far as United States and its allies are concerned, their entire focus is East Asia, Southeast Asia centric. And even when the capacities and capabilities are built up, including the bases that are coming up, the Australian base coming up in the Indian Ocean, their intrinsic ranges and ability to bring about any substantial changes in the Indian Ocean region across the Malacca Strait, going up to the east coast of Africa, are very, very limited. So that leaves Indian strategic planners to deal with this whole situation, both in the continental and maritime domain, essentially largely on its own. We are cognizant of the fact that our partnership with you, as well as our partners with Japan and as part of maritime domain initiatives and other large number of initiatives that we have, provides us with a large amount of intrinsic information and capacities, but they are simply not adequate. They are simply not adequate. So what is imperative from our perspective is that we need an architecture which is whole of Indo-Pacific centric. But there is a big problem. The problem basically is that there is the South China Sea, a lake, which China is trying to dominate and will continue to dominate for multiple reasons. Time does not allow me to cover that, but it does. That's where that allows China to deal piecemeal with both the Indian Ocean and the Eastern Seaboard. And along with that, the congruence of partners that is trying to create through Russia and more importantly, North Korea, which is now becoming a joker in the pack, but with nuclear weapons, is creating a new dynamics for the region. So what is important is this, that we cannot expect the pressure on the United States and alliance in Eastern Seaboard will always continue to be so high that they will have very limited residual capacity to come up against us. We have to do this, deal with this whole situation on our own. We are trying to do this whole Atmanirbhar program, our enhancement of capabilities. There is a shift in our strategic thinking. We are looking at long range vectors. We're looking at long range capacities. We're trying to upgrade our ISR systems, etc., is taking place. But the point at issue is, and the point I'd like to highlight is technology-oriented cooperation, understanding that we need to share essential elements of capacity building and capability building together, not only us, that we can also provide, like indeed we are providing missile systems to BrahMos to Philippines, we're trying to do that to Indonesia, we're also trying to build up capacity at the extent that we are capable. That is an important part. My last point is, in so far as our relationship and how do I see some of the roles, and since Ambassador Sasai and Mr. Suzuki are here, I'll try to just highlight 2-3 points about Japan. The way I look at Japan and its capacity building, I see there is a dilemma which they face because of their economic engagement in the region vis-a-vis their security interests. But the reality is this, is as the competition increases, willy-nilly Japan will be dragged into this competition. And that entire focus will continue to remain East Asia centric. There will be very little facilities and capacities and capabilities left for rest of the Asia. So my suggestion basically is this: we need to think through a whole of Indo-Pacific security architecture approach to deal with the future challenges. Because I didn't get that. Could you try again? So I feel that this is an important aspect, and I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Arun, for pointing out these important factors which pertain to Indo-Pacific security issues. And now I think we have time for discussion and time for follow-up answers from the panelists to suggestions which have been made by other panelists. But before we get into that, I mean, let me just trigger some questions which add to what have already been asked. To Ambassador Sasai, I would just say that the major legacy of the last 15 years is very much of a Abe legacy or Abe Shinzo legacy. And that pertains to the Indo-Pacific, and it pertains to the role of India and Japan acting together. Now, I see that from the diplomatic activity as well as from the pronouncements which are being made by the Japanese leadership at both the levels of the PM and the foreign minister, that there seems to be a certain degree of a shift in Japan's primary focus away from the free and open Indo-Pacific to a free and open international order. Mainly, it seems this is to incorporate the West's preoccupation and Japan's preoccupation with Europe. And clearly, Japan's relations with Russia have deteriorated very, very substantially. So my question to you is Japan really moving away from the strategic legacy of the Abe era? And what is this new era going to bring in terms of the main approaches which Japan takes. Then there is a joint question I think I'd like to raise with both Nalin Suri and with Ambassador Sasai. And that follows up on the kind of overtures made by President Macron to President Xi Jinping, asking China to intercede with Russia. Japan's foreign minister has recently been to Beijing himself. So what is your assessment? How strong is this Russia-China alliance? And will the West be able to break the axis of strategic cooperation and coordination for a new era? Since I'm at it, I'll also add a couple of questions for the other panelists. I think for Professor Suzuki, overall, I see that Japan is exercising leadership in G7 as the only member from Asia, but the positions it is taking are more Western than within an Asian construct. So can I ask you, what exactly does Japan expect, for example, NATO to do in Asia? Ask that in all earnestness because of the last experience of NATO in Asia in Afghanistan. And to Eric, I think the question from my side would be that throughout the Cold War, the focus was on preventing open conflict between the US and the Soviet Union. Is Europe now hurtling towards a conflict between NATO and Russia? And a follow-up to you, Eric, is about the Indo-Pacific, because you know that in the Indo-Pacific, the US will really have to lead from its own strength, which depends on the resources which are going to be deployed. And it seems to me that the deployment of $9 billion for the Pacific Deterrence Initiative in the NDAA, which is 1/12 of the resources which have been provided to in terms of assistance to Ukraine. What do you think this signals for US credibility in this region? There is a question for Arun Sehgal as well, and also for General Huda. Arun and Eric, if you could please weigh in on the nuclear issues, the nuclear overhang. Are we going to see more nuclearization in East Asia as a result of growing tensions? And Ukraine, in order to bolster Ukraine's security, will the US seek to re-nuclearize Ukraine? That's one. That's two of you. And final question to General Huda. From the scenarios which you have projected, are there any key lessons for the Indian military to learn? I'm asking that because there is a lot of questions coming in from participants in the question box, which are saying that this has already been a very long conflict. I mean, are we now going to be preparing for longer and more and deeper conflicts, etc.? There's one question from a important member of the participants, and this is to you, Eric. There is some talk in the US about the current administration wanting to dismantle the Russian Federation, analogous to the breakdown of the USSR. So the US may not, in fact, be in favor of any early end to the war. That's about it. I think I've got a lot of questions here lying here, but please go ahead. Let's start again with the panelists, starting with Ambassador Sasai.
Well, thank you, Hemant. The first questions about Japanese policy toward the Indo-Pacific relating to continuations of Prime Minister Abe's legacy. Is that changing? I mean, I'm a bit, I don't know why you are getting that impression that we are away from the focus on the Indo-Pacific, solely because we are more deeply involved with European and Ukraine issues. I think I don't think the way you take this is not necessarily correct. I think the Prime Minister, current government, I mean the Prime Minister Kishida's policy is continue to build on the legacy of Prime Minister Abe, and Prime Minister Abe's effort to introduce this Indo-Pacific concept and operationalize it. And I think there is a long way to further strengthen this operationalization effort. And that includes the important countries like India and Australia and ASEAN and all the countries in the regions. And I think there is enormous efforts underway on the part of the current Kishida government to make more specific commitment and development program, not only economic one, but more of the security assistance to the countries in the region. That should, and I would imagine that there should be more security collaborations and relationships taking place between, for example, Japan and India, not necessarily purely limited to Japan, US, and India, or Japan, Australia, India, mini trilateral, exercise context. I think there is more sort of recognition of the important role to be played by India, and in terms of, I would say, de facto, more sort of a strategic, partners in the region to advance this Indo-Pacific idea. And I know that there is always some dissatisfaction. We are not paying sufficient attention to your needs, including some of the technology transfers, and also taking care of your own, diplomatic other security concerns around the relationship with China. But also, I think there is some sense that that we should be more cooperative in terms of increasing and rise of India, both in terms of economic role in the region and also security role in the region. And I think there shouldn't be any sort of misunderstanding on the intentions of Japanese government at this moment, and also future steps we are going to take. And for the moment, I think the wrong impression, I would say, given to you, if there is any, is that we are more heavily involved with Ukrainian issue compared to, say, 10 years ago, previous round of Russian invasion into Crimea, for example. I think we are more on the edge of G7 at the time. But over the years, I think magnitude of this, denial of the sovereign right in a brutal way by Russia is not something we could define it simply as a European, NATO, civilizational issues, because it's a violations of international norms manifested by United Nations. I mean, Russians are committed to that. And so I think we can't simply, laugh at their own, statement that they are following all these, principle UN charters. They would say it, but they are actually, betraying by their behavior. We shouldn't simply sit back and, saying that, well, this is a European issue. They need to take care of their own. There is something else, around here. That's not something I think Japanese are now taking, but it doesn't mean that we would place and put more energy in our own global sort of exercise and undertaking. I think our major focus continue to be in the Pacific. If you read it carefully, this G7 foreign ministers statement, and also all this press conference remarks by our foreign ministers and so forth, is saying that we need to overreach the country in the South. And India is quoted as a top leader of this global South. I think that was repeatedly, referred to in the statement. And I think even this, discussions among G7 foreign ministers meeting, there was much discussions about we would get support from global South, not simply on the issues of Ukrainian issues, but also on the issues of Chinese challenges. And it's not simply matter of how you would place your own resources, energies. And I think I just want you to correct your sort of perception about what we are trying to do in the region. I think prime minister and a government, I'm not representing the government anymore, is basically to extend and further, I would say, make substantial steps to be taken to make this free and open Indo-Pacific vital. I think that's what I want to say on the first point. The second one is, what do I see? I mean, all this relationship between China and Russia. Of course, there is an increasing concern, not simply in the realm of global order and rule of law issues, but more because of this strategic geopolitical sort of implications of their de facto political unity and economic, I would say, collaboration taking place. As we move on, Russia would continue to depend on China as we see more of the pressure upon Russia through Ukraine, because it's not a pressure upon Russia, but for the sake of putting Russia, in a very serious domestic turmoil. I think the assumption is more to give a proper pressure upon Putin to come to terms with us on the future peace settlement. On that score, I want to say this one. I think there is a tremendous distrust among the possible role of China as an honest broker, I mean, in the future. But there are 3 points I want to make. One, I think, as everybody agreed, China is not really, suggesting Putin to use a nuclear weapons. I mean, they are against it. That is a good thing, at least for the moment. Number 2 is that they are not officially saying that they would support militarily in Russia. Through third countries and other informal means, they might be doing something, especially all this dual, technology stuff, including possibly some semiconductors and others. But this is not, manifested sort of way of developing military weapon to Russia. So they are at this moment still calculating the strategic interest of doing that to Russia and the, very harsh reaction coming from the United States. So if the future relationship with the United States could be worsened, then they might have more incentive to use this Russian card, vis-a-vis the United States. That could be possible. But for the moment, I think they continue to walk on the fine line to take into account their strategic relationship with the United States and the gains, giving support to Russia. The third point is that in the future, I still think that there is some role to be played by China, and especially when Russia is in a very difficult position, especially when there could be some push back from Ukraine on the ground, and then they might think that they need to buy some time or reconstruct their future hit back, or whatever the reason might be. If there is some incentive for them to go for the de facto sort of, I don't say frozen, but the de facto sort of ceasefire of the thought, if China could use their leverage on the political and economic side vis-a-vis Russia wisely and properly, China could be one of the few countries which could talk to Russia and even to Ukraine. I mean, Ukraine's position on China is not necessarily totally negative, as we all know. So in the future, if there is some limited role to be played China, we shouldn't totally say that you can't trust you. I mean, still, I think if the United States and Europe and also Japan, I mean, we are more or less on the same front as Western countries. So it's hard for us to play that role. But a country like China could still play that role. And then I think India, I think it is India. I mean, and also country like possibly Brazil. I don't know, South Africa. But if they say that they represent the voice of, global South, try to take the leadership, try to convince that there is no merit of further, fight between Russia and Ukraine. I think if you say that there is a majority in terms of number of the countries behind you, you could mobilize all these majority silent nations and to tell that it's a time for you to make a settlement. I think India is in a position and could be in a position to do it. For that, I really agree with Eric on the important role to be played by India.
Okay, thanks. Thank you very much, Ken, because it's particularly helpful for us in India to hear the reassuring words which you have just spoken of regarding the nature of Japan's commitment to the Indo-Pacific, to India, and also to the broader issues which have brought us together under the legacy of former Prime Minister Abe. So thank you. And also the other points which you have mentioned are very well taken. Can we move on now to Nalin? Would you like to comment on the questions which have come up?
Thank you. Let me first try and address what Eric raised. He put me on the mat very, very conveniently. But I think General Huda and General Saigal have answered most of the aspects which would cover my response. Let me just add, and I think you will understand, I was very interested to hear the parallel you drew between the Iran and Iraq war. And that takes me to remind you and remind all of us that the Ukraine war didn't just happen. There's a big history behind it. Now, I'm not trying to apportion blame here, but I think you know and I know, and let me first clarify, I'm not speaking on behalf of the government of India, I have nothing to do with them. Let me remind everybody here that we all knew this was going to happen. It could have been prevented. The question is, why wasn't it prevented? Now, if you constantly keep shoving a red rag in front of me, at some point I will charge. It's a mistake which they made, tactical mistake, strategic mistake, sorry. How they made such a blunder, I don't understand, but they did it. Now, the consequence of that blunder is not just being felt by Europe, but I underline the fact it's being felt by the whole world. Because so much has changed, and as you agreed with me, Eric, that the impact is going to last for a long time. And I'm not particularly sanguine about the very relaxed position that G7 has taken at the Foreign Ministers Conference. That actually it will all be back to square one. Everything will be back to square one. It's not going to be back to anything. Not in the economic terms, not in strategic terms, not in political terms, not in terms of multilateralism. No. I mean, let's face it, the UN has ceased to be an effective body. As it was reasonably ineffective even before this. It is now completely ineffective. So what are you going to do? Now, it's all very well to apportion blame. I am not going to stand here and say I defend anything that Russia did. But I think the blame is not simply on Russia. That much I will say. I think this war could have been prevented. It need not have happened. I think Crimea was a signal. And as General Huda reminded us, the war in parts of Ukraine, you can call it a civil war, whatever you want to call it, the number of casualties have been going on for years. It was a hidden conflict which nobody wanted to recognize till I think one day the Russians felt overly threatened. You asked me what is required to bring an end to this. I really don't know. I think a lot will depend upon how this so-called spring offensive works out. As Ambassador Sesai himself said, if the Ukrainian counterattack is successful, to some degree, there will be one set of outcomes. If not, there could be a different set of outcomes. But I think one bottom line we all have to recognize, irrespective of who is in power in Moscow, that regime is not going to accept a further expansion of NATO to bring it right to its borders. I think this has been known to all of us who handled the breakup of the Cold War, who handled, the end of the Cold War, who handled the breakup of the Soviet Union, that there are certain strategic red lines which should not have been crossed. They have been crossed. Mistakes get made. This is more than just a mistake. I think this was a very major mistake. How we proceed on this, I don't know. That's why I asked, in fact, in our internal discussion before this webinar, we were wondering whether what President Macron said during his visit to China was said after some degree of consultation with allies in the West, including the United States. Was this a way of trying to test the waters? I don't think that there will be a break in Western unity, but I think the important fact is a solution has to be found. I don't think it's in Europe's interest. I don't think it's in the United States' interest. It's certainly not in the interest of a country like India, and certainly not in the interest of the Indo-Pacific architecture that this war continues indefinitely. So I think the focus has to be on finding a way out. Everybody will have to climb down. Everybody. There are no victors in this conflict, I'm afraid. Because if we start talking about victors, then we will have a situation where we may not exist any longer. So I think we are really talking about very serious business. We should not take this at all lightly. Things can go horribly out of hand. Good sense has prevailed so far. Let's pray it continues to prevail. But we cannot. There is no simplistic answer to what you said, Eric, because of the history of this whole conflict. The history of how Europe has evolved post the end of the Cold War. How history has evolved post the rise of China. Who was responsible for that? Should this not have been thought through earlier? Was Russia driven into the arms of China? You and I have discussed this. We have discussed this during our visits to Washington with you and with your other colleagues. I think there needs to be a lot of soul searching done over here, but the immediate requirement is to find a peaceful solution, starting with a ceasefire, climb down by all sides. I see only one major red line, as I said. No further expansion of NATO. Now that is really for NATO to decide and for Europe to decide. It is not for India to advise anybody. You asked me what is a possible bottom line. So I'm giving that possible bottom line as an Indian analyst. It has nothing to do with what government's position may or may not be. Insofar as the Sino-Russian partnership is concerned, I don't see too much sunlight there. It is quite clear to me, at least, that the Russians do not agree with all that the Chinese want to do. For instance, there are considerable differences between the Russian approach to the GDI, the GSI, and the GCI. I don't need to spell them out to all of you. You know what they mean. But the Chinese have a game plan. It's a very well-drawn game plan, which has been evolving in phases over the last 20 years. Under Xi Jinping, it has gained speed because they see an opportunity. And it is definitely a question of my system being at least as good as yours, if not better than yours. Now, the jury is out on whether the world will accept this or not. if we don't want the world to accept that worldview, and we want the world to sustain the worldview that country like ours share, which is democracy with all its values and its weaknesses, then we have to get our act together. So what I'm trying to say is the onus is on us. They are on the ascendancy. They have found a partner who needs them. But I will reiterate what I said in my presentation. In my assessment, I may be wrong, and I can be challenged. I'll be happy to be challenged. I can dwell on this at length if we need to. China needs Russia today as much as the other way around. China is not as omnipotent as people would like to believe. So I think, and if, the question is, the United States has already begun, I think, taking a series of countermeasures in Africa, for instance. The problem that arises in places like Africa and even Latin America is that if you ignore them for too long and you suddenly come with a basket of goodies, they'll take the goodies, but they're going to be wary. So I think consistency in implementation of policy and approaches is very important. But it's not that we cannot take on this challenge of the Chinese model of development. We can certainly take it on. But it needs to have a response that is cogent, well thought out, and consistent. I mean, I could go on for a long time, but I think there'll be other people who are to step in. So I'll stop at this point. Thank you.
Thank you, Nalin. Thank you for giving us your views on those important questions. Can we quickly wrap up because we're already over time? Can we just spend another 5-7 minutes in wrapping up the rest of the remarks? Professor Suzuki?
Okay, so yes, in 5 minutes, I'll stop. Just to comment on what Ambassador Suri said, history may be painful for Russia. Expansion of NATO may be unacceptable for Russia, but that does not justify the use of force in the international system. And I think we need to be clear.
Suzuki, force has been used repeatedly in the international system over the last 30 years. So I don't think we should be talking about use of force should not be justified, etc., etc. And I can remind you that force which has been used over the last 30 years has been used not necessarily with the United Nations Security Council sanction. It has been used outside the United Nations Security Council sanction. So we should be careful when we make these sweeping statements which are somewhat one-sided, because I think
I'm not taking any sides. I do mention all the use of forces against the non-use of force is wrong. That's what I meant. Okay. I mean, I'm not supporting anybody. I'm just simply stating the facts. that use of force is only allowed when there is the United Nations Security Council resolution or in case of the self-defense. So that's the bottom line. So no matter who used the forces, doesn't matter. That's the rules of international law, and so I just simply saying that the history and the expansion of NATO cannot be justified. So to respond to your question, Ambassador Sin, I think this is a sort of a similar question to Ambassador Sasai, that the Prime Minister Kishida is taking a sort of a step away from the Prime Minister Abe's legacy. I think that the situation is different. I mean, Prime Minister Abe, of course, he had this objective of the to resolve the territorial issue with Russia. So he had this very high priority of negotiating with Vladimir Putin. So I think this has not been the sort of a central focus after the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. So I think the situation has changed, and I don't know what Prime Minister Abe was in the place of the Prime Minister Kishida in the February 24th of 2022. I don't. Maybe Prime Minister Abe may take the similar decision of imposing sanctions against Russia and giving up all this the possible future of the negotiation. So I think in that regard, it's the situation is different. Therefore, the Prime Minister Kishida's policy seems to be different from what Prime Minister Abe did. But in terms of the westernization, I think Prime Minister Abe was the first one to attend the NATO summit, and he was also very concerned, and he was actively engaging with the Asia Pacific portion of the collaboration of the Asia Pacific countries and the NATO. So I think, and it's not just Japan, it's AP4, which means Japan, South Korea, New Zealand, and Australia are attending the NATO meetings. So that means that it's not about the Japan's policy alone. It's the sort of a change of international structure, the focusing on how to improve the security situation. Each members have different concerns. Japan, South Korea, sharing the concerns of the North Korea imposing its sanctions, and of course Japan and the United States sharing the same concerns about China. So NATO framework may not be the sort of a primary framework for the security architecture in East Asia or Asia Pacific or Indo-Pacific, but I think it's good to have the NATO on board for, I wouldn't say containing China, but I think it is to make sure that the expansion of China is not acceptable for not only in East Asia but also in Europe. And one of the interesting part is that it is important for acknowledging the NATO members that there is a risks or security risks or even threat from China, and to recognize, to make them recognize the role of China in the international system. Because as you mentioned, the visit of President Macron to Beijing has demonstrated that the Europeans have a very strong interest in engaging with China for at least economic matters. Okay, economic matters, fine, but in terms of security, I think it is necessary for all NATO members to understand the potential of the NATO, potential of the Chinese military capabilities, and make sure that there is a necessity for the collaborative work to reduce the Chinese ambition and intent to expand.
Okay, so thank you, Professor Suzuki. That's an interesting perspective. Why NATO is the only caveat I would put in on that is that we recently had a 20-year intervention in Asia by NATO, and we all know how it ended. The second point is that Asia and emerging Asia comprises of a large number of strategically independent powers who are rising and who believe more in the arena multipolarity. And to see a Western alliance having any kind of a role out here would be a very hard sell. I can assure you that there'll be very few takers. Maybe in Japan, you could think about it, but NATO in Asia is really going to drive another wedge into the divisions which already exist between nations across, especially in the Indo-Pacific. I would give Eric the last word. So I want a very quick wrap up from Arun and from General Huda, so that I give him the last word, because the United States is extremely important in all these factors which we have been discussing. And it would be very important to hear Eric on those matters. So quickly, Arun, would you like to wrap up, and then we have a wrap up quickly in a minute each, please?
Yeah, I just would like to just highlight on the issue of strategic stability in Asia. Bottom line is up in the air. We are seeing China expanding its nuclear arsenal. Its latest reports indicate that China's fusion reactors are coming on steam, which means more plutonium, which means more weapon systems. Already the number is going up. Then we have North Korea, which is continuing with this testing and upgrading its nuclear arsenal, which will force, like the Republic of Korea are saying, the Koreans are saying very clearly, is that at some stage they will also need to make a choice. So we are seeing, and I presume, as far as Japan is concerned, they will look at the efficacy of an extended deterrence, how effective it is, how does it impact the security dynamics, and so they will also take a call. So we are seeing an explosive expansion of nuclear capacities and capabilities in Asia, which is not a very good sign. And this, unfortunately, is going to continue because the arms control regime itself is collapsing. We only have the New START, which is in place at this point in time, nothing more, nothing less. So it's, as for strategic stability is concerned, I'm not going to Ukraine as yet, no time, but I'm talking about Asia. This is a very trying time for strategic stability in Asia. I'll stop.
Dipender, will you please wrap up?
Yeah, very, very quickly, sir, because today the Indian Army and the Indian military is also looking at major restructuring of forces. So I think I'll just flag three important lessons from Ukraine. The first is, you need to look at the correct structuring of forces. This over-reliance on large platforms like aircraft, battleships, tanks. These are things that have come up in the Ukraine war that really have not been as effective as we thought they would be. So the reliance on technology, dual use systems, unmanned systems, information warfare, etc. So we need to find the correct structure. The Indian military has also been talking in the past about swift and decisive wars, and I think Ukraine has taught us that lesson, that you can start a war and not necessarily it'll be swift and decisive. So plan for a long duration conflict. And finally, there's again a lot of talk about continental versus maritime power, and I think what Ukraine war has shown is the importance of land power, because ultimately success is going to be counted in terms of territories captured, territories recaptured, and so for the ground holding role, I think land power is extremely important. I'll stop.
Thank you, Dipender. Eric, you have this last word. Please tell us what we should expect now, having heard all the presentations and the responses in the Q&A.
Yeah, I'll do my best to be quick, and I'm sorry that I will not be able to be fully just to all of the insights and comments that have been made. But first, on the question of history, as an American, I just appreciate the fact that our political culture here in the United States is very forgetful. We're a nation of amnesiacs, and we're not always mindful of world history. And I think that contributes to less than optimal policy outcomes when the United States involves itself around the world. That's my own view as an American citizen. It's a problem that we need to deal with. I do would say that despite the fact that we have oftentimes irresponsible talk in Washington and elsewhere in this country about world affairs, which does not reflect on history, I would say de facto NATO expansion was very much on pause under Obama and under Trump. And it was all of that time that Russia built its own elaborate justification for this war. Now I say that acknowledging fully well that Russia has had a deep felt insecurity with respect to Eastern Europe, going back to Tsar Nicholas, and certainly the rhetoric coming out of Russia these days talks about how the conflict in Ukraine has been going on for a much longer time than that. So Americans need to be very mindful of that. As far as the question in the Q&A goes, there has been loose talk, again, in Washington, in think tanks and elsewhere, about the potential disintegration, about the US abetting the disintegration of the Russian Federation. To my knowledge and in my involvements, have never once seen anybody in a position of responsibility believe that or say that. That is not US policy, as far as I understand. And you know, when the USSR was disintegrating, there was an analysis done at the highest levels of government about what would happen if Russia proper were to disintegrate along with it. And the consequences of that for world stability in Europe and Asia, all over the place, were deemed, I think properly so, to be so great that the United States stepped in to try to, and succeeded, I would say, in helping to stop that from happening. And that remains, I think, the fundamental strategic analysis in the United States. The United States does not want for Russia to suffer any more than it has due to the horrible actions of Putin and his supporters. On the question of a lot of discussion about the maritime continental dialectic, as it were. I do think one of the terrible consequences of the Ukraine conflict, the strategic consequences, that it has delayed the ongoing shift that has been taking place over the last 15, 20 years in the United States. It has delayed our shift to being an Asia first country. As we're all aware, none of us are operating in a strategy-free environment anymore, and we need to make priorities. And there has been, I think, a generational shift that has been up and coming, in which America sees its future fundamentally more so in the Indo-Pacific than in Europe. And it was in that context that the United States had been encouraging our European allies to make serious investments in their collective defense going back to the mid-1990s. Unfortunately, now that we have a war in Southeastern Europe, that has been delayed. And no, I don't think the NDAA, as Ambassador Singh had mentioned, I don't think that sends the right message about where America is headed and where we need to be going. And this is going to be a problem that we need to think through and work out. I will say this: on recent trips in East Asia, including in Japan, I think that the larger thing that we're seeing, yes, there seems to be a de facto sort of multipolarity emerging in Eurasia in many respects. But the larger, I think, geopolitical split that we're seeing is between the Russia-China combine, as Brigadier Segal had put it, and not the West, but the maritime democracies of the world. The fact that the leading Asian democracies, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, have stepped up in such a deliberate and strategic fashion to offset perceived American inattention in Asia, and to take real significant steps to secure the peace in East Asia, I think is extremely significant and probably will be far more consequential over the long range than the revitalization that we've actually seen in NATO proper. And I think that that's something that we need to think about. I think it's within that context that we need to have a serious discussion about where India fits into this emerging bifurcation between these continental powers, Russia and China, and the strengthening maritime coalition of advanced democracies. That I think is going to be a large question for all of us going forward. And it's my view that India best future is in partnership with the maritime democracies.
Thank you, Eric. That's an extremely valuable summation from your side, also responding to the questions which were raised. I also thought that your approach was very constructive, and of course, it's ending on the more positive side, which is we need to look more seriously on what we can do together and among the maritime democracies, and meet the challenges together, which is going to become increasingly important as we go forward. Let me just say that we are well over time, so I would like to thank each and every one of the panelists. Ken, thank you very much. It was a very robust presentation on where Japan stands on these various issues. It's important for your partner India to understand where I know that you do not speak for the government, but nonetheless, as a very senior analyst, I think we value your opinion. And thank you, Professor Suzuki, for bringing up your perspective. That was also very helpful. The one issue which we need to clearly discuss much more about and understand much more about is on that NATO question, but we will leave that for another occasion. Eric, as usual, very good partner at the Hudson. We look forward to seeing you in the United States pretty soon. And we look forward, of course, to remaining in touch. Some of these ideas which you are mentioning are on our mind as well. As far as my colleagues here are concerned, Nalin, thank you for bringing your very candid views to the table on where things stand in Europe and how they originate and what might be required and what may be the red lines or the bottom lines of the contours of any possible settlement which might emerge. We honestly hope that something will emerge, because this so-called spring offensive, everybody is waiting for seeing how and what it will do in terms of propelling the two sides towards peace. And certainly, as you point out, India will always be on the side of peace and trying to make sure that there is no further conflict, because it has tremendous consequences for the global South. General Huda, thank you for bringing I know that you're just back from Europe, so you brought a little bit of a perspective from your trip as well on understanding where the situation on the ground in the war lies. And I hope some of these lessons will be important for the Indian military to take. And Arun, thank you once again for bringing the Indo-Pacific perspective into play in your remarks, because that's where the United States, India, Japan, of course, other partners included Australia and others have to play an increasingly important role. And we are at the moment at risk of being handled and tackled piecemeal because Japan is located in East Asia, Western Pacific. The South China Sea is actually bifurcating this Indo-Pacific, of which India and Japan are bookends, and creating a bit of a wedge. India is therefore left standalone to deal with issues in the Indian Ocean. I think many of these aspects are important, and I'm very glad to hear from Ambassador Ken Sasai that it is in our interest that Japan also bilaterally start working more seriously with India, not just in the trilateral and quadrilateral formats on the defense and security side. So thank you all very much. I want to end by saying I don't have any remarks as such, but I would like to say that we are living in difficult times. The predominance of geopolitical issues is evident across the world today. And this conflict, if it continues, will make things even more difficult, because the fragmentation of world order, emergence of blocs, breakdown of multilateralism, that tendency and that trend will continue. We are facing a new reality, which is the China-Russia alliance, and that impacts the United States, India, and Japan, all three nations. We need to see what it really means going forward. At least I am hopeful that this is not going to be a kind of a harbinger for more unilateral assertions by great powers, including the authoritarian powers, because here in Asia, we are mainly dealing with that element of power assertion and coercion. There is going to be some effort involved in reducing the alienation of the quote unquote rest. And in the rest, I really put both the emerging nations and powers and the global South. And I would really hope and expect that there is further progress in a more inclusive decision-making, more balanced and democratic accommodation of interests. And if Japan leading G7 and can reach out and do something with India leading the G20 this year in that direction, it would be very good. And to conclude on a very positive note, this was one of the elements which I picked out from Prime Minister Kishida's remarks in Delhi, that decision-making must be made constructively through much greater degrees of dialogue. I think if we can follow up on some of those lines, maybe we can make a difference together to a more stable, secure, and prosperous Indo-Pacific. So let me conclude there. Once again, thank you all the panelists. Some of you have woken up very early in the morning. Some of you are staying late past their dinner time. So many thanks to our international participants in Japan and in the United States. And many thanks to my colleagues here in DPG. I'd also like to thank our participants. There's been a large public following this discussion, and we hope to see them again very soon at the next webinar hosted by the Delhi Policy Group. Thank you, and bye-bye for now.